Hello guys, welcome back to another video, and today is going to be part 4 of my Blood and Iron card review. So with about how many cards there are in this expansion, it's like high 80s. It means that there's going to be around 5 parts. So this is part 4 of probably part 5 of 5 parts total, where I'm going to go over and give all of my initial thoughts on all of the cards in Blood and Iron before the expansion comes out on November 28th, which as of the day of recording is in 2 days. It's this coming Thursday that the expansion drops. So, you know, the last video should be coming out probably the day after this. And then it will be the expansion day, and you can play with these cards yourself or see other people play with them. You know, people might be streaming, I might be streaming. So yeah, a lot to look forward to. And today we really get into the meat of what is going to be strong next expansion. We've seen, you know, some very powerful stuff with Throp. We've seen some maybe powerful stuff with 4-attack Germany. But at the end of the day, we haven't seen a lot from Britain. And we're going to get a lot of British cards here, along with a few other very powerful cards for a few other archetypes, and just some very interesting cards overall. So this is a very fun one. And this is a largely first reaction. I make sure I go through and look at all of these cards, you know, before recording, so I have an idea of what the card says and can start to thinking about some of the talking points on it. But, you know, this is a somewhat of a fresh reaction to these cards, so... yeah, take that how you will, and let's roll the intro and then jump into the cards.
What a performance there by J King.
J King, full plot armor.
J King is pushing himself into the ranks of the legend.
J King is our world champion! J King 7! What? The back-to-back Cards world champion!
Alrighty, so we are starting off with Hull Down, which is a 2-cost standard Soviet order that says choose a tank in your hand. When it is deployed, it gets +1/+2 and fights a random enemy unit. So this could be used in a T-34 deck, obviously, where this essentially lets you invest 2 credits on an earlier turn to turn your T-34 into some sort of removal, turn it into a tempo play. And this is very interesting because it allows you to make T-34s have tempo without just printing T-34s that say, like, deployment deal 4 damage or something. So it's a very interesting way of trying to give the T-34 deck more tempo-based options. Now, how good is this card in particular? Not amazing. 2 credit +1/+2 is not terrible. It's the same buff on Sea Embargo, but the difference is Sea Embargo gives you a card, whereas this doesn't. It just gives an effect to a card that is required to be in your hand already, and the +1/+2 is on a card in your hand, and then you still, on a later date, have to spend the credits to get that card out, and it attacks a random enemy unit, so it might just, you know, attack your opponent's, like, 10-1 unit and then die immediately, and then the +1/+2 didn't matter. So it's an interesting card. You can also play this outside of T-34 decks, although I feel like if you're playing tank deck that's not T-34 and isn't using some weird combo, I don't even understand how it would work yet. Maybe if you're doing some combo OTK deck with the tank that gets damaged, gets additional attack when it's damaged, and you throw Hull Down on it so it can attack something immediately to get damaged while getting more stats, and then you attack face with it. I don't know. Sounds like a really bad combo. And if you're not doing something like that, you're probably playing a bit more of an aggressive tank deck, and you're not going to want to be taking a massive 2-credit tempo loss to get a tempo gain on a further turn. Whereas, I mentioned in an earlier video that what T-34 needs is something to do in the early game, and if you're playing against a lot of slow mid-range decks, in sort of the meta we're seeing right now, where turn 2, your opponent doesn't have anything on the board, and instead of putting down something on the board that is going to be threatening, you can instead just play Hull Down, so that when you're playing your T-34s on curve on, like, turn 4 or turn 5, now it's actually doing something. It's going to fight an enemy unit, you don't immediately lose board presence, and then you can try to curve out into your, like, other T-34 buff support cards. So there's a world where you maybe run like one or two of these in a T34 deck, depending on what the meta is. But if there's aggro is seen a meaningful presence, you probably don't have the time to ever play this, unless maybe it's air, in which case you run hull down just because you have no other way of easily reaching the air units. But yeah, it's overall very interesting card, for especially considering that it is just a standard. And also, it just opens up more possibilities in the future for those types of effect, give a card in your hand X effect. It's not really something that we've seen a lot of in cards. Next, we have a T34 76D, which is a 4-cost 4/4 standard tank for Soviets to operation cost. And it is a T34, as is in the name. And most of the T34s we have seen are 5-cost 5/5 2-op. We did see the T34PL, which is the Polish Exile T34, which is a 4-cost 4/4 2-op cost with Blitz and Heavy Armor. This one has Heavy Armor, and it says Destruction. Draw a T34 from your deck and reduce its cost by 2. And this can be anything from the T34 Tribal. So that is a very powerful effect. A 4-cost 4/4 Heavy Armor 1 tank with Destruction draw card is not bad. And it's also reducing it by 2 credits, which is very meaningful in a T34 deck. So all around, this is a very, very solid T34. It's also something you can play out on turn 4, which the deck needs, or just later in the game for only 4 credits versus 5 credits, especially when T34s are now able to do things sort of on their own, with a lot of ways to get your T34s to fight. This might even make it easier to just trigger the destruction effect, and that is the one downside of this card, is it is a destruction effect and not a deployment effect, and I'm happy about that, so you can't just like sort of chain T34s in the late game, and it gives your opponent an opportunity to counterplay, but it does mean that your opponent has an opportunity to counterplay, which means they can suppress this, so you don't get the destruction effect, or it can be hard to trade off a 4/4 Heavy Armor 1 a unit. So your opponent could just like stop you from trading into this. And of course, when you eventually do draw T34, you're going to be running a variety of T34s in your deck. And basically you're just getting this to draw a big unit that is reduced in cost, so you can play it and maybe use it more with other of your sort of T34 support cards. But the fact that it is random, it does add some variance where you can't like consistently get the Blitz tank if you really need to trade out a specific unit in the front line, for example. And it can just draw a second T34 76D. But all around, very, very solid card. This is a huge support to the T34 deck, and we're finally reaching the point where T34 doesn't build itself, which is an issue with some of these more niche archetypes in the past, where it's just like, okay, well, to build this archetype, you just put in every single card of that archetype, and with a few exceptions of just absolutely atrocious cards. And then you just put in like the good elites and the good like utility cards for that faction, and then that's the deck. We're now actually getting to the point where there's enough T34 cards that you can't run all of them in a deck. And if you could, it would be bad because it's at the cost of running the sort of non-direct synergy archetype cards. So now you actually have meaningful choices in the deck building stage. We're going to have to test out what the optimal rates of all of these are. Maybe there'll be some unclear disagreement there, and people will actually build just different versions of T34. Maybe there's a more controlling version, maybe there's a slightly more tempo sort of board swarm version. We'll have to see. All around, very exciting stuff for Soviets, and it's not looking as powerful as some of the other stuff in this expansion, but at the very least it's interesting, and that's something that it's been kind of difficult to say for Soviet archetypes in the last like year and a half, where they've just gotten bad and boring stuff. Now it's going to be interesting and possibly still bad stuff, but we'll have to see. Then we have the 269th Rifles. It is a 3-cost, 1-operation, 2/4 infantry limited rarity for Soviets. And we saw previously, I could not tell you the name of it because it is a Soviet infantry unit, but the 1-cost, 1/2 smokescreen unit that became veteran when you deploy a tank with 4 or more attack, and when it became veteran, it became a 2/2 blitz that draws you 2 cards. This has the same exact text. It becomes veteran when you deploy a tank with 4 or more attack. It doesn't have smokescreen though. And when it becomes veteran, it becomes a 3/4 blitz, and it has the passive effect, your tanks operate for 1 less. So -1 operation cost is really, really huge. This is the same text as on Amur. Obviously, Amur does other stuff, but just additional ways to reduce the operation cost is very, very good for the T-34 deck. And if you can get 2 of these effects on the board at once, now you're cooking, because every time you play a T-34, it operates for free. So if it has Blitz, then you could just play that, and, you know, it's like a big T-34. Or, sorry, it's like a big 35T. And, you know, you're just off to the races. This card, I'm less convinced is going to be good in a sort of optimized T-34 list. Just because on 3 credit 2/4 is really awkward. You can't really play it down on curve. It's just far too easy to remove, and even if you could, like, your follow-up is going to be the T-34 76D that we just looked at, and that doesn't have Blitz, and even if it did have Blitz, it would go from 2 operation to 1 operation, and if you're playing that on 3 and then that on 4, you also can't attack with the buffed up version of this if you're doing it on 3 and then 4. So it's a card you're playing later in the game, but if you're playing it later in the game, wouldn't you rather have other options? Or maybe you just don't even need this effect anymore. I see this card more in a somewhat more aggressive, non-T-34 dedicated, just regular tank deck that we've seen getting a lot of support. And maybe in the end, T-34s are just a bit too slow for the meta, but maybe just a more aggressive Soviet tempo tank deck could be around. And if it was around, and it was running tanks that didn't all have 0 operation cost, you'll probably run a few copies of this guy, just because you'll have units on the board earlier in the game. You'll have a lot of tanks that have 4 attack, probably 4 attack exactly, because those tanks will be on the cheaper side, and most of them will have Blitz, so a card like this is going to be very, very useful. So yeah, all around, very interesting card, sort of supports Soviet tank decks in a way that we haven't really seen before. Now we have Cyclone Division. It is a 6-cost 8/8 infantry for the USA, and the big guy, it is a special rarity, and it has 3 operation cost, and you might immediately think, well, it's a 6-cost 8/8 3 operation cost, obviously this is going to fit the Throp deck. Well, let's get into the card, because it says deployment, add a Sherman to your hand, becomes a veteran when you have deployed 2 Shermans, and that is once this is on the board, and then you have deployed 2 Shermans at any point while this is on the board, it becomes veteran, and the veteran version is still an 8/8, its operation cost is now 0, and it has the passive effect that at the start of your turn, add a random Sherman tank to your hand and give it Blitz. And the Sherman tanks is sort of the M4 tribal that we've seen, and it includes a lot of cards that are currently in the game. The most well-known is just the M4 Sherman, which is the 4/4 tank that draws 2 cards if you have a US unit in the front line. So this seems to be fitting a different deck, because all of the Shermans all have 2 operation cost. And if you're playing a Throp deck, you want to be playing a deck with Throp, 3 operation cost units. So this does not really fit into a Throp deck, and you just have better options for Throp units, and this doesn't do enough on its own to fit into that deck at all. So then the question becomes, is there a sort of Sherman deck you can build? And to be completely honest, based on what we've seen so far, I would say absolutely not. This card seems ludicrously slow. Like, just how many credits do you need to sink into this for this to then just be a sort of value generator? Like, it's giving you cards to your hand, but the cards it's giving you are all kind of expensive mid-range tanks. Yeah, this just seems like if you have the credits to not just immediately lose the game, to play this and the Shermans, then I feel like there's just better things you can be doing with those credits. So all around, I think this card's a bit of a stinker, but maybe the Shermans get a lot of support. Then we have the 62nd Armored Infantry, and this card is far more interesting, and also is a bit more of a Sherman support, sort of the sub-theme, I guess, to the big brother of Throp for USA this expansion. So the 62nd Armored Infantry is a 4-cost 4/4 infantry, limited rarity, 1 operation cost. With deployment, your Shermans get +2/+2. If you have none, add a M4 Sherman to your hand. And this is where this card gets very interesting, because obviously if you're playing a Sherman deck and you have lots of Shermans on the board, I don't at all see in what world that you are supposed to be able to have this happen. I really don't get it. But, you know, if you do have a lot of Shermans on the board, and, you know, you keep generating Shermans with your Cyclone division, and just your entire deck is 4-cost tanks, and then you play a 60-second Armored Infantry, and then you give all of your 4/4 tanks +2/2, and they become 6/6 tanks, and you pop off. Yeah, that seems really, really bad. Where this card gets very interesting, though, is the second part of this text where it says if you don't have any Shermans, add an M4 Sherman to your hand. And as we mentioned, M4 Sherman is the good Sherman. It is the 4/4 that draws 2 cards if you have a USA unit in the front line. And this is where it gets interesting for mid-range decks, like Frontline specifically, where suddenly, you know, 4 Shermans is good. 4 Shermans, everyone's agreed on, you're running 4 Shermans. Would you run 4 Shermans and 1 60-second Armored Infantry as just a 4-cost 4/4 infantry that will essentially draw you a Sherman, quote-unquote? Because sometimes if you play Frontline, if you've ever played Frontline for like more than 10 games, you will have one of those games where you never find any of your Shermans and you get absolutely crushed. Or you have a game where you don't have the front line, so you have to play down your Sherman and use your Sherman to try to fight for the front line, but then you don't find a second Sherman and you get absolutely crushed. Would you play like a one-of card that basically gives you a guaranteed Sherman? It's basically just like a 5th Sherman, kind of. Maybe. And then it also has some flexibility where it can be used to buff a Sherman or 2 on board to get a good value trade. It's not a card that you would run 3 of, absolutely not at all, because it's just very low tempo. But depending on what the meta's looking like, I could see a world where maybe you run 1 or maybe even 2 of these in a frontline deck to just sort of consistently get your Shermans, consistently maybe even generate a bit more value if frontline becomes a little bit more value-oriented. It's a very interesting card. Then we have the Calliope, the Calliope, I have no idea how you pronounce this card. And it is a 3-cost 2/4 artillery with 2 operation cost for USA, standard rarity. And it says, deployment, distribute 2 damage between target and adjacent enemies. So essentially, you target a unit, and that unit and its adjacent will take 2 damage split between the 3 of them if you're targeting a unit with 3 options, or if you're targeting a unit with 2 options, it will distribute between the 2 of them. And that's very high RNG, because it can, based on how it's worded, it can hit the same thing twice. You can target a unit and it damages both of the adjacent units, or maybe it damages one of the adjacent units twice and it doesn't damage the thing you target. There's a bit of thinking to this, because, you know, you can increase the odds of it damaging something by not targeting the thing in the middle, but by targeting something on the side, just to reduce the number of targets that are available for this thing to hit. But all around, I mean, I guess it's comparable to the Nebelwerfer, which is just a 3-credit 2/2 artillery with 1 operation cost that's deployment to deal 1 damage to a target enemy unit. And that card saw play a long time ago. Obviously, the +2 health on a 3-drop artillery is huge, but it has 2 operation cost, and it's sometimes not going to do what you want it to do. The big thing is, if there's only 1 unit in the line, it will be a guaranteed 2 damage, and then it's just a big Kitty Hawk. It's like Kitty Hawk, but also it has +1 health, and then also it's an artillery, and that's really, really good. So how good this card is, honestly, it seems a little hard to evaluate at the moment. If decks don't run a lot of removal in the new expansion, I could see this being a pretty good card in a handful of decks, just because artilleries are really good. It's a turn 3 artillery that has high health and does something the turn you play it. So if you're doing stuff on turn 1 and turn 2, maybe you just throw out one of these guys and it's doing some stuff. The other thing about this card, if you are like me and are not super familiar with the in-depth intricacies of World War II equipment, if you look at it, the art of this card, it is basically an M4 Sherman with a whole bunch of like artillery mounted on top of it. So it's been officially confirmed that this card is going to count as a M4 Sherman. Well, specifically, like, it will count as a Sherman for the Sherman cards, for the stuff that's like the Cyclone division where you have to deploy Shermans, or for the infantry unit that we looked at that gives Shermans +2/+2 if they're on the board. And you know, maybe if you're playing frontline and you're running a few Calliope, maybe you do run that guy, because +2/+2 to a 2/4 artillery is pretty big. So yeah, maybe Frontline will manage to fit in a very small Sherman sub-theme into it. It's definitely not going to be with Cyclone divisions, though. But yeah, all around, a very interesting card. You know, not nearly as scary in potential as, say, another 3-cost, 4 health standard artillery that we've seen in the past, the swag. But yeah, all around, it is above average for artilleries in this game. Artilleries are often really, really bad because they're very scared of them being too strong. And this one has the possibility of being strong enough to see play, but probably not the ability to be strong enough to warrant a nerf unless the meta is running in a very specific way or this deployment effect does not work in the way I think it does. Next, we have the 306th Regiment, which is a 3-cost, 4/3 standard infantry, 1 operation cost for US, and it just has a very simple effect. Deployment, draw a card if you control another unit with 4 or more attack. This is, I believe, the first card we've seen in US that has the 4 or more attack sort of wording stapled onto it. And obviously you could run this in a number of decks because it's just a 3-cost, 4/3 deployment, draw a card if you meet X criterion, and depending on how easy it is for your deck to meet that criteria, then, you know, it's a pretty good card. A 3-cost, 4/3 draw a card when you play it is not a bad card. It's not an amazing card on an infantry, but again, it depends a lot on the type of deck you're playing. Where I think that this card could see play is if the German 4-attack deck is running a US ally, and I think that is a pretty reasonable assumption just based on a lot of things and historically what allied nations Germany has gone with. If they are running US ally, then 306th Regiment is just a very cheap way to get a 4-attack unit on the board if you're going to be doing some case blue shenanigans, or the infantry unit that generates credits when you play 3 or 4 attack units. And then the other thing is it will cycle, and that will give that card draw, or that it will give that deck card draw in a way that Germany can sometimes struggle with. So just having a few copies of a guy that cycles seems like a really good way to just fill out your deck with decent, cheap units that can be played on their own, but can be played to support the larger 4-attack theme. But again, maybe that deck is just refined enough that it doesn't have those just like slots it needs to fill. Maybe it has a very specific way it is built, and in that case, this card might not see any play, and I think that's pretty fine. Then we have the Zamosk Uprising. It is a 2-cost Polish order, standard rarity, Intel 2 retreat target unit. And honestly, this is a pretty good card. Again, it comes down to an issue with all of the minor nations, which is it good enough to be one of the 12 cards you're allowed from that nation into your deck? And the answer is I have no idea if it's good enough for that. Because it really just depends the way you're building Poland. Poland has had a lot of different ways to build it. People have tried out with a lot of different types of cards, and maybe down the line, if certain cards get rotated, maybe you throw this in. Now, I can't really see running this as more than a one-off, unless you're not caring about the intel at all, and you're exclusively running this for the 2-credit retreat a unit, because that's incredibly powerful. Just the rate at which retreat is traditionally been cost is pretty high. Like, it's around 2 credits, but it's always tied to another effect that will make it more expensive than that. So just a simple 2-credit retreat target unit is a very interesting card. Now, obviously, there's certain things where, like, you know, if you're just using it to get around a guard, it's just worse duress, because duress is 0 credits to get around a guard. This is 2 credits get around a guard. But you can do some insane tempo plays with this. Think the original 99th. It used to be if you have a unit in the front line, retreat a target enemy unit. And obviously that came with a 2/3 body. But that was one of the best cards in the game, and it had to be nerfed. So just having this on a standard, is that good enough to run? I'm not sure. I could see running this as 1 or 2 of in a dedicated Legions deck. I could also see doing something like a US-Poland mid-range deck, where maybe you just run one of these as just like, if you're on the more aggressive side, as a cheap way to just get a huge amount of tempo. But I could also see this card just like never really making a splash. Intel 2 is kind of crazy on this. A lot of the cheap Intel orders have Intel 1, and that's perfectly reasonable. The fact that this is Intel 2 on a standard is kind of wild. I don't know why they felt the need to go up to 2 when this easily could have been Intel 1. That makes this card a lot more powerful in decks that are not dedicated Legions decks, because if you're going to have a card that says Intel on it, you want it... The Legions decks don't typically care how much Intel is on it. They just want a card that has Intel, because then it will buff their Legions and draw on the turn house. If you're not a Legions deck, you actually care a lot more about the Intel. In that, like, the Legions decks also care, like, the same amount on the Intel, but if you're playing a tempo deck, just the higher number on the Intel card, if you're going to be running the card anyways, it gets substantially better, because it's going to just be giving you more information on what cards to play around. And this is just a very powerful card. Hopefully it works properly. We've seen Intel and Retreat not work properly in the past, where it will be retreated, and then you will gain Intel on the card you retreated, before you naturally gain the Intel on the fact that you retreated a card to their hand. But also it says target unit, so you can retreat your own stuff, so there's some weird self-retreating things maybe you can do, but probably not. Then we have Order of the Day. It is a 3-cost standard finish order, and this says add 2 sissy units to your support line. Your sissy get... It costs the enemy +1 credit to target or attack this unit. So the sissy units are just a 1/1 with, when this damages an enemy unit, destroy it. So 3 cost, summon 2 of those. Not terrible, not amazing. Finland typically doesn't try to do much of that. And it gives them the added effect of it costs the enemy +1 credit to target or attack this. And that is very significant, because then it's just harder for them to sort of chip them off for free with like a Heinkel or a Sickle or whatever they're doing. The downside is this doesn't matter if they're playing an AoE, so they still just sort of get wiped by like a supply priorities or something. And they don't get blitz, so you can't do anything with them immediately. And yeah, overall, this is a card that is probably quite polarizing in the decks that it's really good into. So like a deck like Frontline, where you don't typically have a lot of ways to get rid of units other than just straight unit on unit trading, this is essentially just a 3-credit 2-for-1, which is pretty good. But against other decks, like against Brit Air, this is a 3-credit do literally nothing. So yeah, it's an interesting card. Also, it's a standard, so that means you're able to generate 8 sissies across 4 cards, and that's important for the card that we looked at in one of the previous videos that says give all of your sissies +3/+3. And at the time I said, well, there's not really any easy ways to just have sissies on the board. Well, if you're just spamming out Order of the Days over and over and over, you can just make 8 army of 4/4 sissies. That's just way worse than things that's way worse than things Finland can do now in the game, with just their control package or their salvage package. This seems worse than both of those, and both of those are not good enough to see any significant play now, so this seems really, really bad. But, you know, it's just a fun thing, and maybe it gets more support in the future. Then we get on to Britain, and here we go. Yesterday we saw the first sort of themes of what Britain's no attack theme was going to look like, and we saw specifically the Cheshire, which was a 2-cost 0/5 that says if the enemy did not attack this unit at the start of your turn, if the enemy did not attack this unit last turn, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ. And that seems to be the card that you're going to try to build the deck around. And, you know, it's only 3 of them, but if you can stick 1 or 2 of them for any significant amount of time, you're probably just going to burn out your opponent. So what cards are Britain going to get on top of the cards Britain already has, and the cards that Britain is getting back, including Monty? What cards is Britain going to get on top of that to support this archetype? Well, here we go. So we have Frontier Force. It is a 3-cost 2/5 Fury Infantry. So just a 3-cost 2/5 Fury Infantry is like a pretty good stat line. Not amazing, but for an infantry, not bad. We've seen a lot of really, really poorly statted infantry units in the past. A lot of them are just like 2/4s or even like a 2/5, but it's a vanilla. Fury is just like a good keyword, you know? You can trade out a 4/4 with this. Just a really solid card. But obviously not good enough to buy on its own to run. So what does it say? It says deployment add a garrison unit to your support line. Well, what is a garrison unit? This is similar to the Sissy or the Legions, where it is a specific unit, a token unit, if you will, that is generated by a bunch of different cards. but it's a card that you can't run in your deck normally. Like, you can't, it's not in your collection. You can't just look it up. It can only be generated off of these things. So when you play this, it adds a garrison unit to your support line. What's a garrison unit? Well, this is a garrison unit. It is a 0/3 guard with 1 cost if it ever gets retreated to your hand, or if there's a way to add them to your hand. And it says, at the start of your turn, deal 1 damage to the enemy HQ if this unit was not attacked last turn. So it's a mini Cheshire. So you know how I said, well, 3 Cheshire, that is not an amazing thing, but that's enough to be a win condition that you will absolutely run 3 Cheshire in your deck, and certain decks are just going to not be able to deal with 3 Cheshire, and that can be a huge issue for them. Well, if there's 3 Cheshire, and then also you're running, like, the ability to generate, like, an additional, like, 15 garrison units, which each of them is half a Cheshire, well, you know, suddenly you're running, like, 10 Cheshires in your deck, functionally, and that's kind of insane, because it's really, really difficult to continuously get rid of these guys. Now, obviously, if you just have full board control, it doesn't really matter. Your opponent plays this card, it goes to your turn, you trade it out for free because it's a 0/3 with guard, so it makes it easier to target. That's one of the things I mentioned about Cheshire, was the fact that it didn't have guard meant that it was easier to protect. This one is less easy to protect, but again, if you're able to generate a lot of garrison units over and over and over, then eventually you're just going to stick these things, and even if they only deal a little bit of damage at a time, it's not that bad. And another thing to remember about these is all of them are essentially gain 3 health. Because every time your opponent kills a garrison unit, that's 3 damage they're not doing to your HQ, and it has guard, so it can prevent your opponent from just having, like, a blitzkrieg lethal. It might even be healing you more than 3 if they're having to kill this with, like, a 6 attack thing over and over and over. Yeah. This is a terrifying archetype, I have to say. Just, unless all of the rest of the cards they get are absolute garbage, this is looking to me like the most powerful archetype of this expansion. So far, at the very least, enough that it's going to be very, very popular and very, very powerful, and even if it's not the best deck, it's going to see enough play that it's going to be annoying. But yeah, I'm a little concerned about this. I hope maybe it gets the self-damage treatment, or not the self-damage, the self-credit denial treatment of being nerfed into the dirt after, like, you know, 3 weeks, because I'm terrified of this. But what are the other ways to gain garrison units? Well, let's look at Entanglement. It is a 1-cost countermeasure, standard rarity for Britain. And it says, when your unit is attacked, give your unit +2 defense, and add a garrison unit to your support line. So this is basically like stubborn defense, but it costs 1 credit, and instead of drawing a card, it's immediately playing a garrison unit. And this is pretty powerful. Just on its own, this is like a decent effect, but you're also getting a unit with guard added to your support line, which can then protect the thing that they attacked into. So if there's a unit that your opponent really wants to kill, like, for example, a Cheshire, and they attack into it with, say, they have, like, a 3 attack unit and a 2 attack unit on the board, and they're going to trade both of them into your 5 health Cheshire, and they attack with the 3 health unit, and it gets Entanglement, so it goes from 2 health to 4 health, and then it summons a 0/3 guard next to it, and now your 2 attack unit can't kill anything. It will still stop the damage because it is attacking the unit. Because again, all of these things are, if they were attacked, they don't have to be killed immediately, but, you know, it's not easy to just consistently have all those units to be attacking into, because Britain still has access to Carpet Bomb and Wave After Wave, and Monty is coming back, and presumably they're going to have other ways to pin units, and they're just going to have other cards on the board that you're having to deal with. They're going to be playing their Sextons, they're going to be playing their Lancasters, they're going to be playing their Wellingtons, and you're going to have to deal with these really annoying units, on top of very consistently having units on board to attack and stop these cards from just burning you down. I will say, though, Entanglement seems a little harder to fit in, like, 4 stacks of. I mean, this, the Frontier Force also seems like it would be difficult to run 4 stacks of. It really depends on what these decks are looking like. And also it depends on the additional ways to generate garrison units. Garrison units seem less important to the deck to me immediately than Cheshire units. Obviously, you're going to be running 3 Cheshire in this deck, and you'll fit in garrison units where you can, unless the cards are just really good on their own. And this card does not seem that good on its own. And this card doesn't seem that good on its own. And when I'm saying not that good, I mean, like, they're very solid cards. they're absolutely very solid cards, and if you introduced these cards 4 years ago, people would play them. Are they good enough now in a world where we have way, way better cards? I'm not necessarily immediately convinced. It depends on the total power level of the deck and what the power level of the deck is compared to other decks in the meta. Do they have to run more counter stuff, or can they afford to just commit further into their synergy? Then we get a British Elite. The last British Elite we looked at was Black Prince, and oh boy, was that the most toxic card I've ever seen in my life. And now they get Desert Dust, a 3-credit Elite order for Britain, and it says pin target unit, add 2 garrison units to your support line, and that's the entire card. It's just 3 credits, pin a unit, and add 2 garrison units to your support line. Yeah, you're gonna run this card in the garrison deck. It's just a really annoying card. Is 3 credit, pin a unit, and add 2 0/3 guards good enough to see play in just like a control deck? Maybe. It depends a lot on what tools Britain has. Obviously on turn 3, you'd like to be doing something that's going to be affecting the health of the units on board, because pinning a unit and then summoning 2 0/3 guards only matters if you're stalling out the opponent to then do a big board clear on the following turn. But how consistently are you going to be able to do that with SS and Monsoon gone? I don't know. But all around, it seems like a very good card at the very least for the don't attack my stuff deck, because you are pinning their unit and you're adding garrison. And also, can I remind you that Forced to Surrender still exists in the game? And at the moment, this deck doesn't seem like it has any particular need for any specific ally nation. But also, I think Snowstorm is still in the game. I don't think that was on the rotation list. I haven't looked at rotation in a little bit, but I believe Snowstorm is still in the game. And you could also do this with Soviet ally, where you play Snowstorm and your opponent can't attack anything. And, you know, if it's... all of these cards don't get a ton of damage in immediately if they all stick for a single turn. But if they all stick for a single turn, then it's really annoying for the opponent to have to answer this on the following turn, because then you'll just have the ability to put more stuff on the board, you'll have the ability to clear the board, maybe push stuff up to the front line. Yeah, all around, this deck looking very, very toxic, but maybe it's just going to get, like, completely run over by the best aggro or tempo deck in the game and end up just preying on slower control decks. We'll have to see. Then we take a break from Britain here and look at the 49th Infantry Regiment. It is a 3-cost, 4/2 infantry, 1 operation cost for Italy, standard rarity, and it says Blitz and deployment. Your HQ gets +4 defense if you control another unit with 4 or more attack. So we saw Italy getting sort of the same theme with their other units. Unlike their other units, this one looks a lot better, because if you can consistently trigger this effect, then it's a 3-credit 4/2 blitz with deployment gain 4 health. So it's sort of like 3 credits, deal 4 damage and heal 4, or 4 credits, deal 4 damage, heal 4 to something in the front line. And that's pretty good. It can also be in like a control deck with an opponent with fewer units. It can absolutely just be pushed up as a threat. The downside is, against aggro, where health is most important, you're probably wanting to be doing this on turn 4, and if you're doing this on turn 4, you almost certainly do not have a 4 health unit on board, so this card seems to pretty much fall flat, and then you can just instead run something like, for example, Attack in the Colonies, where it's just an order that's dedicated damage and healing. So yeah, all around, it's not a bad card, but I just don't see it making the Ally Nation cut to fit into any Italy control decks. I don't think this is making Italy control in a way that it wasn't previously existing in. But yeah, all around, not a terrible card. Better than that special that we looked at in the previous video. Then we have Fukuoka Regiment. I probably butchered that. Apologies. I don't speak Japanese. It is a 4-credit, 4/3 Japanese infantry, special rarity, with 0 operation cost, blitz and fury, and destruction. The enemy gains an extra credit slot. So, at the very beginning of this series, we looked at sort of 1939 wrote out a brief theme, a brief like 1-sentence description of what each nation is going to get, and one of the things Japan had was a sub-theme of big units that have downsides that has upsides for your opponent when you play them. So basically, it's a above rate unit and effects, but when you play it, or when it, in this case, when it dies, it will also benefit your opponent in some way. And this is exactly that. How to evaluate this card is a little tricky. Giving your enemy an extra credit slot is very powerful, but if you're not trading it the turn you play it, you're essentially getting one extra turn before that takes effect. So if you play this and you push it to the front line, and then on your opponent's turn they kill it, they get a credit slot, but they don't get that credit to spend immediately, and then it goes back to your turn and you get another turn before they then have an extra credit on the turn after that. So in a world where you're playing this in an aggro deck, you're not playing this card until you're pretty confident that you're at the stage of the game where you're either winning next turn or you're losing hard enough that you don't really care what your opponent's credit slots are at because you need like very specific top decks. And I just don't see the need for Japan to run that type of card. It's not terrible, but like you're not really gonna be using this to like take two things out in the front line, and then you give your opponent a credit slot because you're not coming back from that game state most of the time. There's a very niche case use where you use this to give your opponent credit slots so that your Great Expanse gives you more credits, but that's probably not going to happen. Although if you Great Expanse on this unit, something that Fury kicks in, the best case I see with this is if Japan ever gets back Lightning Strike or gains a similar effect where essentially infantry can act like tanks for a turn, and in that case a 0-op 4/3 Fury, very easy to buff its attack, say with 2 Final Push, and now suddenly it is a 10/3 Fury with 0-op that can push to the front line and attack the opponent in the HQ twice if you have a card that allows it to activate like a tank. But if that doesn't exist, then your opponent is almost certainly going to be able to remove this, and then it doesn't really do anything. So I don't think this card is particularly good, but it's a lot better than, for example, Mikawa Regiment, which is the 4/4 Blitz Fury that makes everything in your hand cost 1 more when you play it. Then we have the 388th Independent. It is a 5-cost, a 6/4 infantry for Japan, 0 operation cost, with 4 standard rarity, and has Blitz and Destruction. The enemy draws a card. And you look at this card and you're immediately like, well, okay, it's an aggro card, it's 0-op, high attack, Blitz. You throw this out into an aggro deck. Is that good enough? No. 5-cost, 6/4, it's not that difficult to deal 4 damage by turn 5, and the fact that it draws the enemy card is a very, very big upside if you're playing an aggro deck and you're trying to run your opponent out of resources in terms of like their immediate anti-aggro, and then kill them before they can play down the big stuff in their hand. Just giving them an extra card draw is going to make it easier for them to find that needed guard or the needed healing or the needed board clear or whatever it is. But then you stop and think about this card and think, wait, what nations in the game have had the best forced draw themed decks? Well, it's Britain and Japan. Well, what nations have had the best forced draw cards to support the obvious France having the most forced draw cards? Well, the answer is Japan, and yes, they did just lose honorable death, but this forces the opponent to draw a card, and it can act as removal in a control deck as a 5 credit deals 6 damage to something in the front line, upside with your opponent drawing a card. So basically they just gave Japan, France, Mill a way to make your opponent draw 4 additional cards while acting as removal. And removal and forcing the opponent to draw more cards are 2 things that Japan, France, Mill absolutely wanted. Is that enough to make Japan, France, Mill like a super competitive deck? I don't think so. Is it enough to make it a tier 2 deck? Maybe. Why did they print this card? Like, nobody was asking for Mill support. Nobody. And I don't know if this was just oversight on their part, in not realizing, like, not thinking of, like, oh, wait, this is actually a really good card in a control Mill deck, and just sort of lost track of just thinking of this as a very simple aggro card that people probably are not going to play in aggro decks. So yeah, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but, you know, Mill is getting support in a minor way. Then we have a Vistral Course. Again, don't know if that's how it's pronounced. It is a 2-credit standard Soviet order. Target a friendly tank or infantry at the start of your next turn. Give it +3/+3. And this effect is interesting, but it just seems too bad. it just seems far too bad to use. It reminds me a little bit of Juggernaut, which was give a unit +2 attack or +2/+1, and it has to attack every single turn or it dies. And you know, it's a cheap buff, but if your opponent has a way to just pin it or retreat it and it's an infantry, then yeah, it just dies. It feels a similar way, but even worse, because at least Juggernaut you could then trade into something or attack face and get at least a little bit of damage and hope your opponent doesn't have an answer to it. Visceral Course, you're investing 2 credits to do literally nothing, and then your opponent can just remove the card you targeted and then 2-for-1 you very easily. Is there any niche case scenarios where you're using you're targeting a card that you're setting up some sort of combo, or you have ways that make it more difficult for your opponent to do it? I just don't see, because also a 2 credit +3/+3 is a card you would run in an aggro deck, but no aggro deck can afford to do a 2 credit 1 card do nothing on the off chance that your opponent can't remove your presumably low health small unit from the board presumably early on in the game. This card is just absolutely awful. And also this card just, for some reason, reminded me of one other thing I wanted to mention about Desert Dust. Is Desert Dust does not say pin target enemy unit, it says pin target unit, and that means there's no counterplay to this card. If you're just like, I'm not going to play units, and then my opponent can't play their naval powers, because naval powers pin an enemy unit, he'll gain 3 HQ. Desert Dust, you can pin your own units, you can pin your own Cheshire, and it has 0 attack, so you don't care either way, and you can just use this on your own guys to just generate 2 garrisons, even if your opponent doesn't have units on the board. Yeah, just wording matters, and just tiny wording making a very uninteractive card and a very uninteractive deck even more powerful. But anyways, we're not talking about Desert Dust. We are talking about Run the Battlefield, which is a 4 credit German order, standard rarity, and it says for each of your units with 4 or more attack, randomly gain +3 credits, give it +2/+2, or draw a card. So I imagine that the way this card works is it will just go from unit to unit with 4 or more attack, and it will pick one of the effects. So I don't know what the animation will look like, but it will be like the first thing, and then, if it gets +2/+2, that unit will get +2/+2, and then it will move to the next one. So essentially, this is supposed to be one of the engine, I suppose, of the 4 attack deck, and this is certainly a huge payoff. This is certainly a better payoff than Case Blue. It's an easier to play payoff than Case Blue, because one of the 3 things is gain +3 credits, and if you have 3 units, on average, you will get to trigger that at least once, so then this becomes a 1 credit. So, let's say, you have 3 units with 4 or more attack, so let's say hypothetically you trigger each of these ones. So it becomes a 1 credit, draw 1 card, give a unit +2/+2. It's a slightly better for freedom. Well, it's a significantly better for freedom. But also you don't get to choose which of the units gets the +2/+2, and also it's random, so it might not do that at all. It might draw you 3 cards, or it might give all of your units +2/+2, or it might be 4 credits, gain 9 credits, and that's immediately is on a Reichsbank effect. This just could sometimes be 1 roof in Germany. And did Germany need a sometimes 1 roof? No, absolutely not. I hate this card. This is terrible card design. And I say that lightly. The Britain stuff, the stuff that Britain's getting with the garrisons and the Cheshires, that's uninteractive. But at least it's somewhat interesting. It's a novel way to push the game in a way that I think is kind of uninteractive, and it's not going to be particularly fun. But at least it's in theory interesting and unique, and you can see the thought that went into it. Run the Battlefield is just terrible card design. This is very lazy card design. This is the card design that is just ruining the game. This is the most peak Hearthstone card design, where it's just do random crap. It's just, if you play this deck, rather than having to come up with a interesting or actually useful payoff, look at Case Blue. Case Blue sucks. You tried to design a payoff for the deck, and you designed an absolute atrocious piece of crap. And then you just were like, well, what other support can we give this deck? well, let's just throw random crap at the wall, and sometimes you're going to play a 4 credits, gain 8 additional credits on top of that. So sometimes you're just going to gain 4 or 8 credits at the start of your turn. You just start that turn with 8 additional credits, and maybe it draws you cards. Maybe it turns into an enigma. Maybe it buffs your entire board and it's just an alliance. Maybe it does some of that. Maybe it does absolutely nothing, and it does just the worst possible combination of effects to do literally nothing, and then your deck sucks. It's why is the payoff for the deck random? That's terrible. Nobody is going to have fun with this card in any type of competitive situation. You're actively making the game less competitive while you're killing the esports scene. Sorry if I'm getting a little heated, but it's very frustrating to see them just power creep the hell out of the game year after year, while just making the tournament scene absolutely atrocious. And now, on top of that, the power crept cards in the very few tournaments that are going to be left in this game are going to be random? Really? And I don't know if this card's going to be good enough to play. I don't have that much faith in the 4 or more attack deck. It's a lazy archetype to begin with, and it hasn't received that much support. So I don't know if that's going to be a good deck or not. Maybe you're just going to be running a handful of this. Maybe you're not even playing this in a dedicated deck. Maybe you're just playing this like in some sort of type of ramp deck where you just happen to run a lot of units that have 4 or more attack. And you just run this as an occasional, like, it does random stuff, and sometimes it wins you the game card. I don't know. I was going to have this be the last card of the video, but I don't want to end the video on this card. It was really annoying, so I decided to add one more card. And what's that card? Well, it's Slashers. It is a 5-cost, 2/7 British infantry with Fury and Guard, special rarity. And it says, when a friendly unit survives combat, add a garrison unit to your support line. Why? So you know how we looked at the other 2 garrison cards, the first 2 garrison cards, and we're like, these seem a little bit on the weaker side, and then we looked at Desert, the Desert Dust, and it was like, okay, this is getting better. Slashers is just an insane card. It's a 5-credit 2/7 Guard with Fury, but I don't know why it has Fury, but okay, 5-credit 2/7 Guard, 1-op, with Fury, sure, it's slightly below rate. And every time any unit survives combat on either player's turn, add a garrison unit. That includes garrison units surviving combat. Why? 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 Just, like, stop pushing archetypes by giving them, like, a handful of really, really broken, almost always high rarity cards, where it's just like, well, if they don't draw this card, I win the game. If they do draw this card on curve, I lose the game. And again, we saw with covert operations, there was quite a lot of ludicrously power crept cards, and a lot of them were nerfed very, very early on. And then the meta became more enjoyable as the cards got nerfed and nerfed and nerfed and nerfed. But my issue is every single expansion we've seen since Winter War has been the best expansion in the game in terms of just the cards' raw power level have been the best compared to every other card, compared to the other cards in the game and every other expansion that's come out. And it seems that this is no exception with Blood and Iron. And they're just going to continue to print cards like these, and they're just going to continue to push archetypes like these. And yeah, and, you know, I'm positive that this card will be nerfed in some way within maybe 1 month, maybe 2 months, maybe 6 months. But yeah, this card's almost certainly going to be nerfed. And, like, why just not release it at a better version of this card? Why not just release it in a more fair state? Why not release it in a more enjoyable state? And the answer is they want to sell packs. But yeah, that's, at the end of the day, 1939 is a business. Their business is built around selling packs. And yeah, they've decided to do this. They've decided to power creep the hell out of the game while defunding esports. That's very unfortunate, but alas, that is the way that it is. And I don't have much else to say about this, so I will end the video here. And I don't know. I'm not going to say sorry for getting heated, because I care a lot about this game, and I think that they're doing a lot of very, very poor choices. But let me know if you agree with me or disagree with me on, you know, the stuff I've talked about in the last like 5-10 minutes, or on any of the cards overall. Let me know if you think I missed something. Let me know if I changed your mind on anything. If you want to have a bigger discussion, join my Discord. Subscribe if you haven't already to not miss the part 5 and potentially sort of post-expansion gameplay, deck review, those other types of content. Of course, the Elites tier list and a review of my 128 stage World Championship games. All of that coming out soon, and if you can and have the desire to, feel free to donate to help support the channel, link in the description, and I will catch all of y'all in the next one. Thank you very much for watching.